Through rain, snow, and scorching heat, he waited, loyal, unwavering, eyes fixed on the empty road. Days turned to years, yet no one returned. Then, one fateful evening, something changed. The old house stood at the very end of the street, a forgotten relic of a time when life still pulsed within its walls. Its white paint had faded, peeled back by the seasons, revealing the bare wood underneath, like scars on a once proud monument. The windows, covered in layers of dust and grime, reflected the golden hues of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The mailbox hung open, rusted at the hinges, and the once thriving garden was now a wild tangle of weeds, reclaiming what had been left behind. To any passerby, the house looked abandoned, just another empty shell, left to decay. But it wasn't empty. A lone figure stood in front of it, silent and unmoving, his presence both haunting and heartbreaking. Rex. A German shepherd with a thick coat of black and tan, now streaked with dirt, his fur tangled with burrs and dust. His once proud stance was still strong, his eyes still sharp, but there was something else in them now. Something heavy, something lost. He sat on the front porch, like a soldier waiting for orders, staring down the road with quiet, unshaken devotion. Waiting. He had been waiting for years. Once, this house had been filled with life. Laughter echoed through the halls, the scent of home-cooked meals drifted from the kitchen, and the sounds of footsteps, light and fast, belonging to a small boy, raced across the wooden floors. It had been a home, not just a house. It had been Rex's home, and he had not left. Rex had belonged to a boy named Danny. From the moment Danny had been big enough to reach out with chubby fingers and grab a fistful of his soft fur, they had been inseparable. Where Danny went, Rex followed. They had played together, explored together, grown together. Danny's parents, Mark and Julia, had loved Rex as much as their son did. Mark had brought him home one summer afternoon, a tiny pup with oversized paws and ears that flopped comically to the side. He had set him down on the floor in front of Danny, who was just a toddler at the time, barely able to stand on his own. "He's yours, buddy," Mark had said with a smile, watching as his son squealed in delight. Danny had named him Rex, and from that moment, they had been family. The years passed in a blur of childhood joy. Danny and Rex were always together, chasing each other in the backyard, napping in the sun, hiding under the kitchen table when a storm rattled the windows. At night, Rex would curl up beside Danny's bed, his ears always alert, his heartbeat a steady rhythm that lulled the boy to sleep. And then, one day, it all changed. Rex didn't understand why. Suitcases appeared in the hallway, boxes stacked on top of one another. The air smelled different, like dust and change, like something slipping away. Danny's small hands clung to Rex's fur tighter than usual, his face buried against his neck. "I don't want to go," he had whispered. His voice was small, fragile. "I don't want to leave you." But the next morning, they were gone. Rex had chased the car as it pulled out of the driveway, his legs moving as fast as they could, his nails scraping against the pavement. He ran until his paws ached, until his lungs burned, until the car disappeared into the horizon. But it never came back. Days turned to weeks. The food and water left in his bowl disappeared. The familiar scent of his family faded, washed away by rain, scattered by the wind. The house grew silent. And yet, Rex stayed. The neighbors noticed him, a lone dog guarding an empty home. Some tried to take him in, offering food, shelter, kind words, but Rex never followed. He would take a few bites, just enough to survive, and then return to the porch. Waiting. The seasons changed. The first winter without them was the hardest. Snow blanketed the ground, ice crusted over the front steps, and the cold bit deep into his bones. Still, he curled up by the door, his body shivering against the wind, his head resting on the wooden boards. The neighborhood children whispered about him, calling him a ghost dog, a spirit that refused to leave its home. Spring came, and with it, the scent of rain and blooming flowers. The trees budded with new leaves. The world woke from its slumber. But Rex remained the same. His eyes never left the road. Summer burned the pavement beneath his paws, the heat turning the air thick and heavy. He sought shade beneath the porch, his ears twitching at every passing car, his heart leaping with hope, only to sink again when none of them stopped. Autumn covered the ground in golden leaves, the wind carrying them in swirls across the yard. The days grew shorter, the nights longer. Another year had passed, and still Rex waited. He had become a fixture of the street, a silent guardian. Children would point at him as they walked by, parents shaking their heads, murmuring about how he was still there, how he had never left. A new family had moved in down the street, a kind woman named Sarah and her young daughter, Emily. They had tried to call to him, to coax him with treats and warm blankets. But Rex never left the porch. Sarah had sighed one evening as she watched him from her front yard. "That poor dog," she had murmured. "He's waiting for someone who isn't coming back." But Rex didn't believe that. He couldn't, because Danny had promised. "I don't want to leave you." Rex held on to those words, tucked them deep into his heart. One day, they would come back. They had to. So every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Rex would sit on the porch, his body still, his ears perked, his eyes fixed on the road, and he would wait. The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the old wooden fence surrounding the abandoned house. The sky, once golden, had darkened into a deep shade of blue, the stars beginning to flicker in the cold night air. The streetlights buzzed softly, casting a pale glow over the cracked sidewalk, illuminating the figure of Rex, still seated on the porch, still waiting. But something was different tonight. The usual stillness of the neighborhood was interrupted by the low rumble of an approaching truck. Its headlights cut through the dark, bouncing off the broken windows of the house across the street. The engine growled, brakes squealing as it came to a slow stop just a few houses away. Rex lifted his head. His ears perked, his muscles tensed. The scent was unfamiliar. Strangers. The truck doors slammed shut, and 3 men stepped out, their heavy boots crunching against the pavement. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, exhaling a cloud of smoke into the cold night. The others followed, talking in hushed voices as they made their way toward the abandoned house. Rex's fur bristled. His instincts flared with warning. For years, he had guarded this house, kept it safe even when no one else was there. He had chased off strays, barked at wandering drifters, and growled at those who came too close. This was still his home. The men didn't belong here. One of them, a wiry man with nervous hands, pulled a crowbar from the back of the truck. The tallest of the group, the one who had been smoking, nodded toward the front door. "This place is empty. No one's lived here in years. We get in, grab what's left, and get out. Fast." Rex stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. His tired bones protested, his muscles ached, but his loyalty burned stronger than any exhaustion. His amber eyes locked onto the intruders, his body tense with warning. The wiry man hesitated. "You sure it's empty?" he muttered, glancing at Rex. The bearded man scoffed, flicking his cigarette onto the ground. "It's a stray, probably half dead." But Rex wasn't dead, and he wasn't going to let them pass. The moment the man with the crowbar stepped onto the porch, Rex let out a low, deep growl. It rumbled from his chest, a warning, a final chance for them to turn back. The men froze. For the first time, they seemed to take a real look at him. He wasn't just some scrawny stray. He was large, powerful, and despite the dust on his coat, there was no mistaking the strength in his stance. The bearded man clicked his tongue. "He's just an old mutt," he muttered, stepping forward. "Get lost, dog." Rex didn't move. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of dried meat, tossing it toward Rex. "There, go chew on that and leave us alone." Rex didn't even glance at the food. The bearded man's face twisted in irritation. "Stupid dog," he grumbled. "Fine, have it your way." He took another step forward. Rex lunged. His bark shattered the silence, sharp and full of fury, echoing down the street. His teeth flashed as he snapped at the man's leg, just barely missing. The man staggered back, cursing. "Jesus!" the wiry man yelped, jumping away. The bearded man steadied himself, his hand going to his boot. "All right, you want to play rough?" The glint of metal caught the streetlight. A knife. Rex's muscles coiled, ready. He had fought before. He had taken down strangers, defended his family against things far worse than men like these. But before the man could take another step, another voice cut through the night. "Hey!" A figure emerged from the shadows, walking toward them with determined steps. It was Sarah, the woman from down the street. She was still in her work uniform, a thick coat wrapped around her to protect from the cold. Her voice was sharp, filled with warning. "Get away from that house." The men stiffened. The bearded man glanced at her, sizing her up. "Lady, mind your own business." Sarah didn't back down. She pulled out her phone, holding it up where they could see. "I already called the cops. They're on their way." The wiry man looked panicked. "Let's go," he muttered. The bearded man hesitated, glancing back at Rex, who was still standing firm, teeth bared, growling low and steady. Finally, he spit on the ground. "Not worth it." The men turned, moving quickly back to their truck. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, they were gone, swallowed by the night. Sarah exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. She turned to Rex, her expression softening. "You really don't give up, do you?" Rex blinked, watching her carefully. She took a step closer, crouching down in front of him. "You were protecting the house," she murmured. Rex didn't move. Sarah sighed, glancing at the worn collar still around his neck. "I don't know if you understand me, but they're not coming back." Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "It's been years." Rex's ears twitched. Sarah hesitated before reaching into her coat pocket, pulling out a small sandwich wrapped in paper. She unwrapped it, tearing off a piece of bread and holding it out to him. For the first time in years, Rex hesitated. He had been offered food before, by strangers, by kind neighbors, by people who didn't understand. But this felt different. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, taking the small piece of food from her hand. Sarah smiled. "There you go." She stood, stretching her arms, then looked back at the house. "You can't stay out here forever," she murmured. "Winter's coming. And you're not as young as you used to be, are you?" Rex lowered his head slightly. Sarah sighed. "I'll come check on you tomorrow, all right?" She turned, walking back toward her house, pausing just once to glance back at him. Then she disappeared down the street, her figure swallowed by the night. Rex stood in the quiet, feeling the cold settle into his bones. The house behind him loomed, dark and empty, its windows still reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. His heart ached. Danny had promised. "I don't want to leave you." But they were gone. Rex lowered himself onto the porch, curling up against the cold wood. Still, despite everything, despite the years, despite the emptiness, he watched the road. And he waited. The wind carried the scent of winter through the empty streets, biting through Rex's thick fur. The first dusting of frost had begun to settle over the grass, clinging to the broken steps of the old house. The nights were getting colder, longer. But Rex didn't move. He couldn't. This was his home. For weeks, Sarah had kept her word. She came every evening, sometimes with a warm meal, sometimes just to sit near him on the porch. She talked to him, her voice gentle, patient. "You remind me of my dad's old shepherd," she had said one evening, offering him pieces of roasted chicken. He was stubborn, too. Rex would listen, watching her with those same amber eyes that had once tracked the footsteps of a boy who had promised to return. But he never followed Sarah home. No matter how warm her voice was or how kind her touch felt when she brushed dirt from his fur, he stayed. He waited. The neighbors had started talking. They whispered about how long Rex had been there, how impossible it was that he had survived on his own for so many years. "That dog's got a ghost in his heart," one of the older men said to his wife, shaking his head. "He ain't waiting for a family. He's waiting for a miracle." And maybe he was, but miracles didn't come for dogs like Rex. One night, the first real storm of the season hit. The sky cracked open with thunder, rain slashing sideways against the rooftops. The wind howled through the trees, bending the branches until they groaned under the pressure. Rex huddled against the door of the house, his body curled tight, trying to shield himself from the icy downpour. Water dripped from his fur, pooling beneath him, seeping into his aching joints. Still, he didn't leave. But his body was no longer what it had once been. Years of waiting had taken their toll. The cold had settled deep into his bones, slowing him down, making his muscles ache in ways they never had before. His once powerful legs were weaker, his paws stiff when he tried to stand. And that night, as the storm raged around him, something inside Rex gave way. His legs buckled, his head swayed, the world tilted, and then, for the first time in years, Rex collapsed. The morning was cold and gray when Sarah stepped outside, tightening her coat around herself as she made her way down the street. Her breath curled in the air as she reached the old house, her fingers already reaching into her pocket for the bag of leftovers she had saved from dinner the night before. But then she saw him. Rex was still there, lying on the porch, but something was wrong. His body was too still, his fur slick with rain, his breathing shallow. "Rex!" Her heart lurched. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hand against his side. His body was cold. Too cold. "Hey, come on," she whispered, gently shaking him. "Wake up." Nothing. Panic surged through her. He needed help. Now Sarah pulled off her coat, draping it over his body, trying to give him what little warmth she had. She ran back to her house, throwing open the door. "Emily!" she called to her daughter. "Grab some blankets, hurry!" Within minutes, she was back at his side, wrapping him up, pressing her hands against him, trying to feel for a stronger pulse. His eyes barely fluttered open. Sarah clenched her jaw. "I'm not letting you die out here," she muttered, standing up. She wouldn't leave him. Not like this. She ran back to her house, pulling her car up as close as she could. With as much care as possible, she lifted Rex, straining under his weight. His body was limp, heavier than she expected, but she refused to stop. He had waited long enough. She wasn't going to let him wait for death, too. The vet's office smelled like antiseptic and warm fur. Sarah sat in the waiting room, Emily gripping her arm, her small face filled with worry. The clock on the wall ticked endlessly. Finally, the vet stepped out, his expression unreadable. Sarah stood immediately. "How is he?" The vet sighed, rubbing his hands together. "It's a miracle he lasted this long," he admitted. "He's malnourished, his joints are severely weakened, and his heart, it's slowing down." Sarah swallowed hard. "Is he dying?" The vet hesitated. "Not yet, but he can't go back out there." Sarah's throat tightened. "I know." The vet glanced at her, his gaze softening. "He's got fight left in him," he admitted. "But he needs care, a home." Sarah exhaled slowly, looking through the small window where Rex was lying on a soft bed, an IV in his leg. He looked so tired, so lost, but he was still waiting. Sarah pressed a hand against the glass. "Then he can come home with me." The first few nights in Sarah's house were the hardest. Rex would wake in the middle of the night, pacing near the door, staring at it as if expecting someone to walk through it. Sarah would sit beside him, speaking softly, telling him it was okay, that he was safe. But safety wasn't what he wanted. Every time he heard a car outside, his ears would perk, his body tensing. Hope still burned in his chest, even as exhaustion threatened to snuff it out. Days passed. Sarah's daughter, Emily, took a quiet liking to him. She would sit beside him as he rested, reading books out loud, letting her small fingers trace the tips of his fur. One evening, as Sarah washed the dishes, Emily's voice drifted from the living room. "You're a good boy," she whispered. "You don't have to wait anymore." Rex's tail gave a small, tired thump against the floor. Sarah smiled, but Rex wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. A week later, Sarah made a decision. She found an old address, the last known location of Danny's family. It had been years, too many years, but she had to try. The drive was long, but when she arrived, she found a simple home, not unlike the one Rex had guarded for so long. A young man opened the door. Sarah took a breath. "Are you Danny?" The young man frowned. "Yeah, who's asking?" Sarah hesitated before pulling out her phone, showing him the picture she had taken of Rex. "He's been waiting for you." Danny stared. His breath hitched. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone. "That's—" His voice broke. Sarah nodded. "Come with me." When they arrived back home, Rex was lying in the living room, his body rising and falling slowly with each breath. Danny stepped inside. His footsteps were hesitant, shaky. "Rex?" The old dog stirred. Danny knelt beside him, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his fingers shaking as they brushed against the dog's fur. "I never wanted to leave you." Rex's eyes slowly opened, and for the first time in years, his tail wagged. Danny let out a broken laugh, tears slipping down his face. "You waited," he choked out. "You crazy, loyal boy. You waited." Sarah turned away, blinking back her own tears. Rex let out a long sigh, his body sinking against the warmth of Danny's touch. The waiting was over. He had found his way home. For a long moment, the world stood still. Danny's hands trembled as they ran through the thick fur on Rex's neck, his fingers brushing against the worn collar that had somehow stayed intact all these years. His breath came in short, uneven gasps, his chest tightening with a rush of emotions he had buried deep for so long. How had he ever let this happen? Rex's amber eyes, once sharp and full of life, now held a quiet exhaustion. But beneath that tiredness, there was something else. Recognition, a deep, unwavering understanding, a promise fulfilled. Danny swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You waited," he whispered again, his voice breaking under the weight of the years that had slipped between them. Rex's tail gave another slow, gentle thump against the floor. It was weak, barely a movement, but it was there. A response. Danny let out a shuddering breath, his vision blurring as tears threatened to spill over. He had been a child when they left. He had begged his parents not to go, pleaded with them to let him stay behind, to take Rex with them. But they had said no. They had said it wasn't possible, that Rex would find another home, that someone would take care of him. But no one had. Instead, Rex had stayed. Alone. Danny's fingers curled into the thick fur of his best friend's neck, his body shaking with the weight of regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw. "I should have come back. I should have—" His words caught in his throat as Rex did something he hadn't done in years. He leaned forward, pressing his nose against Danny's chest, letting out a soft, tired sigh. Danny froze. That simple, instinctive motion, the same way Rex had comforted him when he was a child, when he had scraped his knee or had a bad dream, sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over him. It didn't matter how many years had passed. Rex still loved him, still forgave him, still saw him as the boy he had once been. Danny's breath hitched, and then he broke. His shoulders shook as the first sob escaped him, his hands fisting into Rex's fur as he bent over his old friend, pressing his forehead to the warm coat that smelled of dust, of rain, of home. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching silently, her own eyes damp. She had expected some kind of reunion, but not like this. Not something so raw, so painful, so overwhelmingly full of love. Danny had been a stranger when she had found him. Just a name, just a hope. But now, watching him hold on to Rex like a lifeline, she knew she had done the right thing. She took a step forward. "He never left," she said quietly. "Through storms, through winters, through everything, he waited for you." Danny nodded, unable to speak. He already knew. He had known the moment he saw Rex's frail body curled on that blanket, the way his ears had twitched at the sound of his voice, the way his tired eyes still held that same unbreakable loyalty. But something was wrong. Even through the overwhelming flood of emotions, Danny could feel it. Rex was fading. His breaths were slow, deep, each one taking a little more effort than the last. Danny's stomach clenched. "No," he whispered, his grip tightening. "No, no, no. You waited for me. You can't go now. Please." Rex's eyes fluttered open again, just barely. Danny turned, frantic. "We have to do something. A hospital. Sarah shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "Danny?" He stopped. His heart pounded against his ribs, his mind racing, grasping for a solution. Any solution. But deep down, he already knew. Rex was tired. He had been waiting for so long. And now, finally, Danny was here. The old dog let out another long, slow sigh, his body sinking further into the warmth of Danny's arms. Danny clenched his jaw, fighting back the fresh wave of tears threatening to spill over. He wasn't ready. He had only just found him again. How could he let him go? But this wasn't about him. Rex had given everything. His love, his loyalty, his years. And now Danny had to give something in return. Peace. With a shaking breath, Danny wiped his eyes and shifted closer, wrapping both arms around Rex, cradling him gently. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't have to wait anymore." Rex's body was warm against his breathing slowing, his heartbeat a steady, fading rhythm beneath Danny's touch. Danny closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against Rex's, his fingers stroking the fur between his ears. "You were the best dog," he murmured, his voice thick with love. "The best friend I ever had." Rex's tail moved one last time, a final beat of love, of understanding, and then, with one last exhale, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Danny didn't move, his arms still wrapped tightly around Rex's body, as if holding him just a little longer would somehow bring him back. Sarah swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as she wiped at her own eyes. Emily sat quietly beside them, her small hand resting on Rex's paw, tears slipping down her cheeks. It was Emily who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not waiting anymore." Danny let out a shaking breath, nodding. Number Rex wasn't waiting anymore, because he had finally come home. For days the house felt different. Empty in a way that had nothing to do with space, quiet in a way that settled deep into the walls. Danny stayed. He didn't go back to his apartment, didn't return to the life he had built miles away. He stayed in the house Rex had guarded, the home he had refused to leave. And one evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Danny stood in the backyard, a small wooden marker nestled beneath the old oak tree. Rex, the best boy. Danny smiled, though his eyes were damp. "I'll take care of it now," he murmured. "You can rest." The wind rustled through the trees, the leaves whispering in the fading light. And for the first time in years, there was peace. The house was quiet now, filled only with the soft hum of the heater as winter settled in. Danny sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee between his hands, staring out the window at the backyard where the old oak tree stood. The wooden marker beneath it caught the faint glow of the porch light, its presence both a comfort and a reminder of what had been lost. It had been weeks since Rex had passed, but the ache in Danny's chest had not lessened. It wasn't just grief. It was the weight of time, of all the years that had slipped through his fingers. He had thought coming back would be painful, and it was. But what he hadn't expected was the strange sense of peace that had begun to settle over him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running. Danny had spent so long trying to outrun the past, burying himself in work, in a life that never quite felt real. He had convinced himself that moving forward meant leaving everything behind. But Rex had never believed that. Rex had never stopped waiting, never stopped hoping. And now, standing in the house that had once been their home, Danny finally understood. He wasn't supposed to move on. He was supposed to come back. The house had needed work. Years of neglect had left it battered and worn, much like the dog that had waited on its porch for far too long. So Danny fixed it. He patched the walls, repainted the trim, cleared the overgrown yard. He replaced the mailbox, repaired the broken fence, swept the dust from the corners of every room. And with every nail hammered, with every brush stroke, it became less of a burden and more of a promise to stay, a promise to build something new. Sarah and Emily visited often, bringing warmth into the house in ways Danny hadn't realized he needed. Emily, in her quiet and thoughtful way, had taken it upon herself to care for Rex's resting place. She would gather flowers, arranging them neatly beneath the oak tree, whispering soft words that only she and the wind could hear. "He was a hero," she told Danny one evening, as she placed a small, carefully drawn picture next to the wooden marker. "He waited for you. He saved this house." Danny swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding. "Yeah, he did." Emily looked up at him, her big eyes solemn. "You're staying, right?" Danny hesitated, the old instinct to keep moving, to keep running, stirring in his chest. But then he looked around, at the house, at the tree, at the place Rex had fought so hard to protect. And for the first time, he felt like he belonged. "Yeah," he said softly, "I'm staying." The first snowfall came quietly, drifting down in soft, delicate flakes that dusted the rooftops and settled over the empty streets. Danny stood on the porch, his hands buried in his jacket pockets, watching as the world around him turned white. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were far away, caught in the past and the present, tangled in memories of running through fresh snow with Rex at his side, their footprints trailing behind them. He closed his eyes, letting the silence of the snowfall wrap around him. Then, a sound, a rustling near the sidewalk. Danny frowned, stepping forward, squinting through the dim light. The street was empty except for a small, shivering shape curled just beyond the gate. A puppy. Tiny, fragile, barely more than skin and bones. Its fur was dirty, its ribs faintly visible beneath the thin coat. It trembled as it watched him, wide-eyed and uncertain, as if deciding whether to run or stay. Danny felt his breath catch. The look in its eyes, it was the same. The same quiet desperation, the same cautious hope. The same way Rex had looked at him all those years ago. Slowly, carefully, Danny knelt, extending a hand. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The puppy flinched but didn't move away. It simply watched him, frozen in place. "You're all alone, huh?" The puppy hesitated, then slowly, it took a single step forward, then another. Danny stayed perfectly still, his hand outstretched, letting the pup come to him on its own terms. It sniffed the air, its tiny body trembling from the cold. And then, finally, it pressed its small, shivering form against Danny's palm. Something inside him cracked open. Something raw. Something healing. Danny let out a slow breath, carefully scooping the puppy into his arms, feeling its tiny heartbeat thrumming against his chest. "You don't have to wait anymore," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The puppy nestled closer, letting out the smallest, softest sigh. Danny held him close, standing beneath the snowfall, his footsteps leading him back inside. Back home. The house was no longer empty. There was warmth again. Sarah and Emily helped Danny name the pup, Scout, for his curiosity, for his bravery. He was nothing like Rex. He was small, clumsy, unsure of himself in a way that made Danny smile. But there was something familiar in his quiet devotion, in the way he followed Danny from room to room, never letting him out of sight. Scout wasn't a replacement. He was a beginning, a new story, a new promise. Danny often found himself watching the old oak tree, the wooden marker beneath it. Some days it made his chest ache. Other days it made him smile. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold and violet, Danny sat on the porch with Scout curled up beside him. The little pup rested his head on Danny's leg, his small body rising and falling with steady, contented breaths. Danny looked up at the sky, the stars blinking into existence. "Hey, Rex," he murmured. The wind rustled through the trees, soft and steady. Danny smiled. He wasn't running anymore. He was home. Winter deepened, blanketing the town in a quiet hush, the streets muffled under thick layers of snow. But inside the once-forgotten house at the end of the street, warmth had returned. The lights glowed softly through the windows, casting golden halos onto the freshly shoveled walkway. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the air with the scent of burning wood, and a small, scrappy pup lay curled up on the couch, his tiny body rising and falling in steady, peaceful breaths. Scout had settled in quickly, learning the sounds and rhythms of his new home. He followed Danny everywhere, padding after him with oversized paws, his ears twitching at every new sound. He wasn't Rex, but he had carved his own space in Danny's heart. And for the first time in years, Danny felt whole. Sarah and Emily visited often. They had become more than just neighbors. They were family. Emily adored Scout, showering him with affection, while Sarah had become Danny's quiet anchor, reminding him that healing wasn't just about remembering. It was about moving forward. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah glanced at Danny. "You're different now," she said softly. Danny tilted his head. "Different how?" She smiled, lighter,